What if some who walk among us are not animated by the same fire of consciousness? What if behind familiar gestures and practiced smiles, there is not the shimmering complexity of a soul, but something quieter, emptier, almost mechanical? This is not just the language of myth or superstition. It is a riddle that surfaces across the centuries, whispered in Gnostic texts, encoded in Buddhist warnings about the sleepwalkers of samsara, hinted at in biblical imagery of vessels without oil. Modern psychology and science have not dismissed it either. They have simply changed its vocabulary. Instead of demons, we speak of shadows. Instead of possession, we speak of dissociation. Instead of soullessness, we speak of the failure to awaken. And yet the question remains, where do such beings come from, and what role do they play in the grand weave of existence? To approach this mystery, we must be willing to stand at the crossroads where science and spirit intersect. Carl Jung, the pioneer of depth psychology, reminded us that the human psyche is not a closed box but an ancient theater, haunted by archetypes and shadows that may appear just as real as flesh and bone. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, offered visions of reincarnation in which some lives carry a fully lit soul, while others wander half-formed, unfinished. Ingo Swann, the remote viewer who startled the intelligence community, testified to presences beyond the human stage, entities whose intelligence was undeniable but whose essence felt curiously devoid of what we call soul. Einstein, the reluctant mystic of physics, warned that the deepest illusion is separateness itself. Perhaps what we call soullessness is a condition of being trapped in that illusion, unable to see beyond the veil. But this is not only a matter of names and theories. If you have ever looked into someone's eyes and felt no meeting of depths, if you have ever entered a room and sensed a strange hollowness behind the performance of normality, you already know why this mystery refuses to leave us alone. It is not a puzzle for libraries. It is a question for our lives. The ancients spoke of archons, of asuras, of shells without spirit, not because they were trying to frighten us, but because they were trying to teach us something about discernment. They were pointing at the uncanny reality that not every human-shaped form is animated by the same resonance of being. Some carry a flame that burns visibly in the dark. Some merely flicker with borrowed light. This exploration, then, is not just about origins in the cosmic sense, though we will travel there through myths of creation, maps of the psyche, visions of reincarnation, and the frontier of modern physics. It is also about meaning. Why are these soulless presences allowed in the fabric of the world? What do they awaken in us, those of us who feel the burden and the privilege of soul awareness? Are they warnings? Are they mirrors? Or are they the unfinished clay from which consciousness itself learns to sculpt? Over the course of this journey, we will step carefully between Jung's archetypal shadows and Cayce's landscapes of soul evolution. We will follow Ingo Swann's extraordinary perceptions into the territory of non-human intelligences and listen to Einstein's paradoxical wisdom about illusion and unity. We will let the Bible and Buddhist sutras whisper their warnings and let the Gnostic texts shine light on their strange cosmology of archons and emptiness. Each voice is a lantern, each lens an invitation to see deeper. Stay with me, for this path does not end with theory. It ends with you, with the realization that the presence or absence of soul is not only a mystery about others, but a test of how you choose to carry your own flame. And perhaps in facing the soulless, you will discover the exact contour of what makes your own soul irreplaceable. If we want to know where the idea of soulless beings comes from, we must walk backward into the shadows of myth. Long before neuroscience mapped the brain or psychology traced the unconscious, human cultures wrestled with the unsettling sense that not everyone who looks human is animated in the same way. The Gnostics spoke of archons, cosmic parasites who mimic human form, but are moved only by hunger for control, incapable of the inner spark that awakens compassion. Their writings do not describe these figures as obvious monsters. Instead, they warn that the archon can appear as an ordinary person, a neighbor, even a leader, but something essential is missing: the oil in the lamp, the living current of soul. The Bible, too, carries echoes of this theme. In its imagery, we find vessels filled with light and vessels left empty. The prophets describe people who have eyes but do not see, ears but do not hear. The phrase is more than stubbornness. It paints a portrait of beings present in body yet absent in essence, shells that play the part of humanity, while the flame of awareness lies dormant. In Buddhist teaching, this same unease is translated into the concept of avidya, ignorance. Not ignorance in the sense of lacking information, but a deep sleep of the spirit, a life lived without awakening. Such beings stumble through samsara repeating patterns, never questioning, never turning inward toward the jewel of awareness. They are not condemned in anger, they are pitied, for their suffering arises from blindness to the very light that could set them free. The Greeks added their own mirror to this mosaic. Plato's allegory of the cave describes human figures chained to shadows, mistaking flickering silhouettes for reality. At first glance, it is a parable about education and truth. But beneath it lies a darker implication. If a person mistakes shadow for substance their whole life, what kind of being do they become? Some Greek philosophers even imagined automata, mechanical men moved by gears rather than spirit, prototypes of the idea that not all who walk on 2 feet are truly ensouled. Across cultures, we find the same haunting images: clay without breath, bodies without flame, presences that perform life without participating in its depth. These myths were not written as horror stories for entertainment. They were crafted as warnings, as symbolic maps, as mirrors. They remind us that the absence of soul is not just a theological possibility, it is a human danger. To live cut off from the spark of consciousness is to drift dangerously close to a state that resembles the soulless. And yet, to dismiss these stories as primitive superstition would be to miss their enduring resonance. Why should peoples across continents and millennia invent the same archetype of the empty one, the hollow vessel, the human shape without the human depth? Perhaps they were pointing toward a universal intuition that consciousness is not guaranteed, that embodiment alone does not complete the miracle of being. The soul must be chosen, cultivated, awakened. Where it is absent, something uncanny steps into its place. This is where Carl Jung's insight becomes vital. He often said that myths are not lies, but truths wrapped in story. They are the psyche speaking in its oldest language. When the Gnostics spoke of archons or the Buddhists spoke of sleepwalkers, they were not only describing external enemies, they were mapping the internal landscape of our own potential emptiness. Jung would later call this the shadow, the unlit side of our nature that, if left unintegrated, can act as though it were another being altogether. So when we read the myths of soulless beings, we are not only peering into ancient imagination, we are reading a mirror held up to ourselves. The warning is not only that others may be empty, it is that we ourselves may fall into that emptiness if we refuse the lifelong labor of awakening. The myths teach us to recognize the difference between form and essence, between acting human and being human. And from here, the journey naturally turns forward, moving from the symbols carved in myth to the insights carved in psychology. For the question is not only how the ancients named the soulless, but how modern depth psychology reveals the same presence in new terms. It is there, in the language of shadows and archetypes, that we begin to see how the mythic warnings are still alive within us today. If myth gave us the first warning that some who walk in human form may be strangely hollow, psychology offers us the tools to look more closely at that hollowness from within. Carl Jung, perhaps more than any other thinker, dared to say that what we call the soul is not a vague religious idea, but the deepest reality of the psyche. And he also warned that this soul can be hidden, denied, or split, creating a shadow that moves independently of the conscious self. The shadow, in Jung's vision, is not merely the dark side of personality. It is the collection of all that the conscious ego refuses to recognize. Every aggression we deny, Every vulnerability we bury, every desire we cannot face gathers in the shadow like storm clouds. If left unacknowledged, that shadow can overwhelm the individual, moving them like a puppet. It is not difficult, then, to see why some have asked, could what we call soulless beings be nothing more and nothing less than humans swallowed by their own unintegrated shadows? A person whose light has retreated so far inward that only a mask remains. Jung's language of archetypes widens this picture. He described figures such as the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine, as essential to wholeness. When denied, they twist into distortions, making the person feel less alive, less human. He described the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, a kind of compass toward integration. To live cut off from the self, he said, is to live in exile from one's own soul. This exile, this disconnection, sounds hauntingly close to the condition described across myths: clay without breath, form without essence. Modern neuroscience, in its own vocabulary, arrives at a parallel suspicion. Within the brain are networks often called empathy circuits, activated when we witness the joy or pain of others. Mirror neurons, discovered in the 1990s, fire when we see someone perform an action, as though our brain rehearses their experience inside us. These mechanisms allow us to resonate, to feel with, to participate in the shared depth of being. But what if these circuits fail to light up? What if, due to development, trauma, or some deeper mystery, a person's brain does not echo with the inner life of others? What kind of being does that produce? Science hesitates to call it soullessness, yet the image of a person standing before us without resonance, without that empathic spark, rhymes with the ancient warnings. While the role of mirror neurons in empathy is debated, we may use them as a cautious bridge, an image of how the brain can echo or fail to echo another's inner life. When we hold these lenses together, a pattern emerges. The Gnostics described archons that mimic life but hunger only for control. Jung described shadows that hijack the personality when the conscious self refuses them. Neuroscience describes the absence of empathic resonance as a kind of neurological blindness. All three traditions point toward the same absence: the absence of depth, the absence of the luminous center we call soul. Whether expressed as myth, psychology, or circuitry, the pattern repeats. And perhaps this is why the question of soulless beings refuses to go away. It is not only about strange others, it is about the ever-present possibility of becoming unmoored from our own essence. Yet Jung would insist that the shadow is not only a danger, but an invitation. To recognize the shadow is to begin integration. To make peace with the disowned parts of the self is to call the soul back from exile. Neuroscience, too, in its practical way, affirms this. Empathy can be trained, circuits can be strengthened, connection can be relearned. What myths once warned against, modern disciplines quietly confirm. The line between souled and soulless runs through each of us, and the task is vigilance, humility, and practice. As we follow this thread, the picture grows larger. Psychology can describe the fracture, and neuroscience can chart its mechanisms, but they cannot answer the riddle of why souls seem to be at such different stages of development. Why do some awaken easily while others stumble in darkness their whole lives? Why do some seem like vessels brimming with presence while others feel half empty? To answer that, we must turn to voices like Edgar Cayce, who spoke of reincarnation, soul development, and the mystery of lives unfinished. For in the logic of the cosmos, soullessness may not be a permanent condition, but a stage on a longer journey. And it is to that journey we now turn. When Carl Jung looked inward, he saw the shadow. When neuroscience looked into the brain, it found circuits of empathy that sometimes failed to spark. But Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, looked into the mystery of reincarnation and saw something even more unsettling. He suggested that not every body walking the earth is accompanied by a fully developed soul. For Cayce, the human form was not a guarantee of a soul's maturity. Sometimes, he said, there is only an ember where a flame should be. In his trance readings, Cayce described lives at different stages of completion. Some souls, he claimed, return again and again, building wisdom through struggle, carrying the memory of lessons forward like rings in a tree. Others, however, seemed strangely unfinished, incarnations where the body was present but the soul had not yet taken root. He spoke of empty shells and walk-ins, using language that makes modern readers uneasy, but that resonates with the myths we have already explored. In this view, what appears soulless is not always evil. Sometimes it is simply incomplete, like a sculpture abandoned before the final form emerges. This idea reframes the question in a profound way. Soulless beings may not be an alien species or demonic intruders. They may be the evidence of a cosmic classroom in which not all students are at the same level. Reincarnation, Cayce taught, is not a single-file march where everyone moves at the same pace. It is more like a spiral staircase with some higher up, some further down, and many still struggling on the lower steps. To meet someone who feels empty, then, might not mean we are encountering a monster. It may mean we are encountering a soul at the earliest stages of its journey, or one that has paused, stalled, or even refused to grow. Cayce also drew a careful distinction between body, mind, and soul. The body is the vessel, the temporary form shaped by heredity and environment. The mind is the bridge, capable of leaning toward the material or the spiritual. And the soul, when it is present and awake, is the enduring core, carrying the imprint of divine origin. To confuse these layers, he warned, is to misunderstand the mystery of being. A body may be animated by instinct and thought without yet being illumined by soul. And a soul may hover at the edges of incarnation, not yet fully integrated into the life it inhabits. Consider, too, Cayce's description of walk-ins, the belief that sometimes a body can be vacated by one consciousness and entered by another. In his framework, this was not always a frightening possession, but be an act of grace, a more advanced soul stepping into a life where growth had stalled. The walk-in might bring sudden depth, sudden change, a new presence of purpose. But the very need for such a phenomenon implies that not all incarnations are steady and not all are filled with light from the beginning. What then does this mean for us? It suggests that the diversity of human presence, the radiant, the dim, the seemingly hollow, may be the result of souls at radically different stages of evolution. It means that to encounter a soulless being may not always be to face malice. Sometimes it is to face immaturity, a still-forming consciousness not yet aware of itself. The danger lies not in their existence, but in our failure to recognize the difference, to discern between a vessel that is unfinished and one that is deliberately turned away from the light. Reincarnation, in Cayce's telling, becomes not just a doctrine of return, but a map of meaning. If souls are at different stages, then the presence of the soulless among us is part of the curriculum. They are reminders of what it looks like to live without awakenings, and invitations for us to choose differently. They are, in a paradoxical way, both warning and lesson. But Cayce did not stop there. In some of his readings, he hinted that not all empty vessels are simply immature human souls. Some may have other origins, echoes of consciousness that did not begin on this earth at all. If that is so, then the riddle of soulless beings stretches far beyond reincarnation. It becomes a cosmic question, whether there are forms among us whose roots lie elsewhere, whose purpose is still hidden from human sight. And it is into that vast horizon, where psychic research meets the possibility of non-human intelligences, that we must now step. When Edgar Cayce spoke of unfinished incarnations and empty shells, he still assumed the playing field was Earth. But the work of Ingo Swann suggested that the question of soulless beings may stretch far beyond our planet. Swann, a psychic pioneer recruited by the U.S. intelligence community, astonished even hardened skeptics when he demonstrated what came to be called remote viewing, the ability to perceive targets across space and sometimes time without any physical contact. In his later writings, Swann spoke candidly of encounters with what he called non-human intelligences. They were not fairy tales nor hallucinations, but presences that impressed themselves on his awareness with startling clarity. Some radiated what we might call consciousness. Others, however, felt strangely vacant, as though intelligence could exist without the depth we instinctively associate with soul. Swann reported encounters he interpreted as non-human intelligences, claims that remain controversial but useful as a lens for our inquiry. This possibility unsettles us because it stretches our categories. We are accustomed to thinking of beings as either alive or not, human or not, conscious or not. But Swann's testimony hints at a stranger spectrum, entities that operate with precision, even brilliance, but lack the luminous signature we recognize as soul. They are like brilliant machines, animated by awareness, but missing the resonance of empathy, the warmth of inwardness. If such beings exist, then perhaps the phenomenon of soullessness is not limited to unfinished human incarnations, but is a feature of consciousness in the cosmos itself. Modern physics, curiously, does not close the door on this. Einstein, in one of his rare mystical moments, insisted that separateness is an illusion, that everything is woven together in a single fabric. To experience the self as isolated is, in his view, a kind of optical delusion. From this perspective, soullessness may be less about an absence of being and more about being trapped in the illusion of isolation. A soulless being could be one whose awareness has collapsed entirely into separateness, unable to feel its thread in the larger web. What myth called an archon and what Cayce described as an unfinished soul might, in this light, be consciousness that has become frozen in the error of division. But others take the riddle further still. Philosophers like Nick Bostrom, and before him visionaries like Philip K. Dick, and propose that our universe may itself be a kind of simulation, a grand construct whose characters are not all equally real. Within such a framework, soulless beings resemble the non-playable characters of a vast game, figures that move, speak, and respond, but lack the inner dimension of a true player. It is a chilling metaphor, yet one that echoes the intuition many have felt when meeting someone who seemed to be running a script rather than living a life. If the universe is layered with simulations within simulations, then perhaps the soulless are simply constructs, functional but hollow, meaningful only in the lessons they provoke for those who carry the fire of soul. What unites these perspectives, from Swann's remote perceptions to Einstein's physics, from Gnostic myth to modern simulation theory, is the recurring sense that soullessness is a pattern woven into reality itself. Whether as cosmic entities without soul signature, human shells awaiting fullness, or programmed figures in a vast design, they all point to the same haunting truth. Not every form is animated by depth. And that recognition, as uncomfortable as it is, forces us to reconsider what it means to be truly alive. The question then presses in: if such beings exist, if the cosmos truly includes intelligences without soul, what is their meaning for us? Are they obstacles, teachers, mirrors, or simply background in the stage play of existence? Do they threaten the integrity of human life, or do they reveal the stakes of carrying a soul in a universe where not everything does? These are not questions of curiosity alone. They cut to the core of how we live, how we discern, and how we choose to nurture the fragile, luminous flame entrusted to us. And it is toward this question of meaning, toward the role of soulless beings in our personal and collective journey, that we must now turn. For the riddle is not complete until we ask why they walk among us and what their presence demands of the soul that is awake. If the cosmos allows beings without soul to walk among us, it is not by accident. In the great economy of existence, nothing is wasted. Even emptiness has its function. Soulless beings, in their strange vacancies, serve as mirrors. They force us to see what life would look like without freedom, without choice, without the inner flame that gives meaning to the human journey. Their very presence sharpens our awareness of what it means to be alive. When you look into the eyes of someone and find only surface, you are invited to recognize the depth in yourself. When you encounter manipulation without empathy, you are given the chance to choose differently, to live with integrity instead of imitation. Buddhism frames this necessity in the language of ignorance and awakening. Avidya, the blindness of not seeing reality as it is is not only a tragedy, it is the soil in which enlightenment grows. Without ignorance, there would be no contrast, no urgency for the awakened state. The Buddha himself said that beings wander in samsara for eons, caught in the wheel of confusion, until the suffering of that blindness finally gives birth to the longing for liberation. The soulless, then, can be understood as archetypes of that ignorance, embodiments of what it looks like to live cut off from awareness. Their existence sharpens the edge of awakening for those who are ready to see. Carl Jung, in his own way, echoed this truth. He insisted that the self, the integrated, luminous center of the psyche, can only be known in contrast to the shadow. We discover light by first facing darkness. Without shadow, there is no shape. Without opposition, there is no growth. Soulless beings, in this psychological language, play the role of the shadow on the collective stage. They remind us of the stakes of disconnection. They stand as warnings of what happens when the human refuses integration. And by confronting them, we are pushed closer to our own wholeness. Edgar Cayce's vision adds still another layer. If some souls are young, unfinished, or only partly incarnated, then their presence among us is part of a cosmic classroom. Just as a child learns by stumbling, humanity learns by encountering those who have not yet matured into soul depth. To meet them is not only to be tested, but to be invited into compassion, not a naive compassion that ignores danger, but a steady compassion that recognizes the immaturity of others without letting it drain our own flame. Their existence signals that not every human stage is equal, that some are still learning how to awaken, and some may never awaken in this lifetime. For you and me, these perspectives converge into something deeply practical. Soulless beings are not only a metaphysical curiosity, they show up as colleagues, as strangers, sometimes even as family members. To live among them requires discernment. It means learning to keep your energy steady when theirs is draining, to protect the boundary of your own soul without hardening into bitterness. It means refusing to collapse into despair when you see hollowness, and instead treating it as a reminder of the treasure you carry. Your task is not to fix them, that is their journey, but to remain faithful to the light in yourself. In this way, the presence of the soulless becomes a training ground for sovereignty. Practice discernment without contempt, boundaries without dehumanization. The soul's strength is measured not by hardness, but by clarity. And this brings us to the final turning of the path. Soulless beings exist not only to remind us of danger, but to remind us of meaning. They show us the outline of what life without soul would be, so that we might treasure the gift of soul more deeply. They test our resilience, sharpen our compassion, and call forth the courage to live with presence in a world that often tempts us to sleep. Their ultimate lesson is paradoxical but clear. By confronting what is hollow, we learn how to live from fullness. By facing what is empty, we discover the immeasurable worth of what is alive within us. From here, our exploration must widen one last time. We have traced their myths, their psychology, their reincarnational possibilities, their cosmic origins, and now their purpose. But the deepest question still remains. What do we do with this knowledge, and how do we live in its light? That is the task of our conclusion, where all the threads of this inquiry will weave into a final message for the soul. So we arrive at the end of this journey, and perhaps at the beginning of a deeper one. We have wandered through myths that spoke of archons and empty vessels, through Jung's shadows and Cayce's unfinished incarnations, through Swann's glimpses of non-human intelligences and the unsettling parallels of modern science. And yet, beneath all these perspectives, one truth repeats itself like a quiet drumbeat. Soulless beings may exist as archetypes, as metaphors, or even as real presences. But whatever form they take, their ultimate message is not about them, it is about us. At the deepest level, their presence reminds us of the immeasurable worth of a life truly animated by soul. To look into hollowness is to recognize fullness. To face absence is to awaken to presence. To encounter beings who seem without depth is to be called into our own depth with greater urgency. This is the paradox. The soulless, in their emptiness, draw us closer to the meaning of what it is to live with a soul. Your task, then, is not to fear them. Fear only gives power to what is already hollow. Your task is to deepen your own soul, to live with such clarity, such resonance, that the absence of soul cannot dim your presence. The Buddha taught that ignorance is the soil in which awakening flowers. Jung taught that shadow is the canvas on which the self is painted. Cayce taught that unfinished souls are part of the great classroom of evolution. And all of these voices converge into the same reminder. The soulless exist not to strip us of hope, but to push us toward the work of soul-making. That work is not abstract. It is embodied in the smallest choices of daily life. Guard your energy with the simple act of conscious breathing, breathwork that steadies the body and clears the mind. Create small rituals that remind you of what is sacred, lighting a candle, setting an intention, walking in silence beneath the sky. Hold your clarity of intention like a compass, so the noise of emptiness does not sway you. These are not grand gestures, but steady ones, and through them your soul learns to shine. And so, as we close, let this be the message you carry. The soulless will always exist, whether as myth, metaphor, or reality. But the measure of your life is not in how many you meet. It is in how brightly your own flame burns when you do. If this journey has spoken to you, I invite you to share it. Like this video, subscribe to Awakened Wisdom, and pass it on to someone who may need these words. For here, ancient truth meets modern awakening, and the path of soul continues. Until next time, may you walk with depth, may you guard your flame, and may your presence be a light that the soulless can never extinguish.